People are still living in villages carved into rock, hidden beneath cliffs, and surrounded by ice. And if you think the modern world has already reached everywhere on Earth, you're about to miss places that feel completely disconnected from reality itself. Because today, we're traveling through hidden villages across mountains, deserts, fjords, and Arctic wilderness, including communities so isolated, they barely seem possible anymore. High in the Himalayas, there are villages where massive landslides and winter snow can still cut people off from the outside world for days at a time. And some of them sit more than 3,500 meters above sea level. That's over 11,500 feet, surrounded by mountains so steep and remote that roads only reach certain areas relatively recently. This is the Langtang Valley in Nepal. For centuries, people here survived through farming, trading, and guiding travelers through the Himalayas. Stone homes were built to withstand freezing winters, while yaks carried supplies across dangerous mountain trails long before modern transport existed in the region. But life here changed forever in 2015. A massive earthquake triggered an enormous avalanche above the valley, destroying entire villages within seconds. In Langtang village itself, huge sections were buried beneath rock, ice, and snow. Hundreds of people lost their lives. And for a moment, it seemed possible that some of these communities might disappear completely. And yet, people returned. Homes were rebuilt, trails reopened. Prayer flags once again appeared above the valley. Today, trekking routes pass through villages that still feel incredibly isolated from the modern world, especially during harsh Himalayan winters. But some hidden communities survive in places even stranger than this, including homes carved directly into volcanic rock itself. Kandovan does not look like a normal village at all. From a distance, the homes resemble giant stone pillars rising directly from the mountainside. But these formations are not abandoned ruins. Many are still used as real homes, with rooms carved directly into volcanic rock. Some families have lived inside these stone structures for generations. The village lies in northwestern Iran, near the remains of an ancient volcanic region. Historians believe people began settling here hundreds of years ago, partly because the unusual rock formations offered natural protection from both weather and invading forces. Even today, life here remains physically demanding. Narrow pathways climb between the rock homes, winters bring heavy snowfall, and many interiors still rely on thick stone walls to regulate temperature naturally. What makes Kandovan especially fascinating is that it never became simply a historical site. People still cook, sleep, work, and raise children inside these cave-like homes every day. But volcanic rock is not the only place where isolated communities learn to survive. Far beyond Iran, another village spent centuries preparing for invasions, avalanches, and some of Europe's harshest mountain winters. At nearly 2,100 meters above sea level, around 6,900 feet, Ushguli stands beneath some of the highest peaks in the Caucasus Mountains. For much of the year, the village feels almost trapped between snow, stone, and sky. What immediately stands out are the medieval stone towers rising above the homes. Many of them were built centuries ago as defensive structures, allowing families to protect themselves during raids or conflicts. Some towers are believed to be nearly 1,000 years old, and together they help the community survive in one of the most isolated regions in Europe. Winter here can still be brutal. Heavy snow regularly blocks roads leading into the valley, while avalanches remain a real danger in the surrounding mountains. Before modern access improved, entire families sometimes remained isolated for weeks during severe storms. Yet daily life continues. Cattle move through narrow village paths. Firewood is stacked beside old stone homes before winter arrives. And despite the harsh conditions, people still choose to stay in a place where survival has always depended on preparation and endurance. The mountains surrounding Ushguli are so massive that they dominate nearly every part of life here. And still, there are communities even farther removed from the modern world. Settlements where isolation is shaped not by mountains, but by Arctic ice and darkness. Some villages in Greenland are so remote that there are still no roads connecting them to neighboring settlements. Instead, supplies often arrive by boat, helicopter, or small aircraft whenever weather conditions allow it. During winter, sea ice and storms can make travel extremely unpredictable, leaving certain communities almost completely isolated from the outside world. Places like Itakartormit and Umanak sit beside frozen fjords and towering Arctic mountains, where brightly colored homes stand out against snow, rock, and ice. Life here depends heavily on preparation. Food, fuel, and basic supplies must often be stored well before winter conditions become severe. In smaller settlements, fishing and hunting still remain an important part of daily survival, especially in areas where fresh deliveries are difficult during storms. Temperatures can fall below -20 degrees Celsius, nearly -4 degrees Fahrenheit, while Arctic winds make conditions feel even harsher. And despite everything, these villages are not disappearing. Children still walk through snow-covered streets to school. Small fishing boats still leave icy harbors during the brief summer season, and families continue living in places that feel almost completely separated from the rest of the world. Yet even Greenland's frozen isolation is not the highest environment where hidden communities survive. In parts of Ladakh, some villages sit above 4,000 meters in elevation, more than 13,000 feet, in a cold desert where oxygen levels are significantly lower than at sea level. Even standing still can feel exhausting here. Surrounded by barren mountains and narrow valleys, many of Ladakh's older villages developed in near isolation for centuries. Long before roads connected the region to the rest of India, trade routes crossed these mountains using yaks and caravans moving slowly through high-altitude passes that were often blocked by snow for much of the year. The environment shapes almost every part of daily life. Homes are traditionally built with thick mud walls designed to trap heat during freezing winters. While many villages depend on carefully controlled glacial water channels to grow crops during the short summer season. Winters here can become extremely severe. Temperatures sometimes fall below -20 degrees Celsius, nearly -4 degrees Fahrenheit, and in smaller settlements, supplies must often be stored months in advance before roads become unreliable. Yet despite the harshness of the landscape, Buddhist monasteries, prayer flags, and small farming communities still remain scattered across these valleys today. And while Ladakh feels remote enough already, some villages stand in places where the ocean itself isolates them from the outside world. For years, reaching Gásadalur meant crossing steep mountain terrain on foot. This tiny village in the Faroe Islands sits beside towering cliffs and the North Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by weather conditions that can change within minutes. Before a road tunnel opened in 2004, residents often had to hike across difficult mountain paths just to reach neighboring communities. Looking at the village today, it almost seems impossible that people chose to build homes here at all. Only a handful of houses sit between green hills and dramatic sea cliffs, while powerful Atlantic winds regularly sweep across the landscape. Fog, rain, and storms are common throughout the year, and the surrounding ocean has shaped life here for generations. One of the most recognizable sights is the waterfall that drops directly into the sea beside the village, creating one of the most dramatic coastal landscapes in Europe. But beyond the scenery, Gásadalur also reveals how isolated communities adapted long before modern infrastructure arrived. Sheep farming and fishing traditionally helped families survive in an environment where nature constantly controlled movement and communication. Aït Benhaddou rises from the edge of the Moroccan desert like an ancient fortress frozen in time. Built from clay and mud brick, this fortified settlement once stood along important caravan routes crossing the Sahara. Traders carrying gold, salt, spices, and other goods passed through here for centuries while moving between North Africa and sub-Saharan regions. The architecture itself was designed for defense and survival in an extremely harsh environment. Thick earthen walls helped protect homes from heat, while the elevated position allowed residents to monitor movement across the surrounding valley. Summer temperatures in this region regularly climb above 40 degrees Celsius, over 104 degrees Fahrenheit, making shade and water absolutely essential. Even today, the dry landscape surrounding the village feels almost unforgiving. What makes Aït Benhaddou especially unusual is how recognizable it has become without losing its isolated atmosphere. The settlement has appeared in major films and television series, yet parts of it still feel remarkably untouched once crowds disappear. Narrow passageways climb toward old defensive towers, and some sections remain so quiet that only footsteps echo through the clay corridors. Reine sits on a narrow strip of land, surrounded by sharp mountain peaks, icy fjords, and the cold waters of the Norwegian Sea. At first glance, it almost looks too dramatic to be real. Bright red fishing cabins stand directly beside the water, while enormous granite walls rise almost vertically behind the village. In winter, snow covers the islands for months, and during strong Arctic storms, the weather here can become extremely unforgiving. Fishing shaped life in Reine for generations. Cod drying racks still appear throughout the region, especially during the winter fishing season, when huge numbers of Arctic cod migrate toward the Lofoten Islands. For centuries, this fish helped sustain entire communities across northern Norway. The isolation here was once far greater than it is today. Before modern bridges and tunnels connected parts of the archipelago, movement between villages often depended entirely on boats and changing sea conditions. And even now, nature still dominates daily life. During winter, daylight becomes extremely limited, while powerful winds moving through the fjords can make the landscape feel almost hostile despite its beauty. But hidden villages are not always shaped by oceans and Arctic storms. Some survived because heavy snow and mountain forests kept them protected from the outside world for centuries. For hundreds of years, villagers in Shirakawa-go built homes designed to survive some of the heaviest snowfall in Japan. The steep triangular roofs are impossible to miss. Covered with thick layers of thatch, they were specifically designed to prevent massive amounts of snow from collapsing the houses during winter. In certain years, snowfall here can exceed 2 meters, more than 6.5 feet, transforming the village into what looks like an entirely different world. Shirakawa-go lies deep in a mountainous region that remained relatively isolated for long periods of history. Before modern roads improved access, winter conditions could make travel extremely difficult, helping preserve the village's unique architecture and traditions. Inside the homes, large attic spaces were often used for silkworm cultivation, providing additional income for families living in this remote valley. Entire generations adapted their daily lives around the demands of snow, cold temperatures, and limited farmland. What makes the village especially striking is how peaceful it becomes during winter evenings. Warm lights glow through the snow-covered houses, while forests and mountains disappear into darkness around the valley. Monsanto was built among enormous granite boulders that look as if they were dropped across the landscape by giants. Some homes are squeezed between massive rocks. Others were constructed directly beneath them, using the stone itself as part of the structure. Walking through the village feels unusual almost immediately because the terrain controls everything: roads, stairways, rooftops, and even the shape of the buildings. This hilltop settlement in Portugal dates back many centuries and was once considered strategically important because of its elevated position. From above, the surrounding landscape stretches for huge distances, making it easier to spot approaching threats long before modern technology existed. The environment also shaped daily survival. Summers here are extremely hot and dry, while strong winds move across the exposed hilltop during colder months. Thick stone walls helped homes remain cooler during heat and more protected during winter weather. Even today, some passageways are so narrow and uneven that vehicles can barely enter parts of the village. And despite becoming more well-known internationally, Monsanto still feels strangely disconnected from modern urban life, especially during quiet evenings when the stone streets empty completely. But some hidden settlements took an even more unusual approach to survival. Göreme was shaped by volcanoes long before humans ever arrived here. The landscape looks almost unnatural. Tall rock formations rise from the valleys in every direction, while caves, tunnels, and hidden rooms cut deep into the soft volcanic stone. Over time, entire communities began carving homes directly into the cliffs, creating one of the most unusual settlements anywhere in the world. Located in the Cappadocia region of central Turkey, Göreme became especially important during the early Christian period. Underground shelters and hidden churches allowed people to survive during times of invasion and instability. Some cave chapels still contain faded paintings that are more than 1,000 years old. But survival here depended heavily on the landscape itself. The volcanic rock was soft enough to carve using simple tools, yet strong enough to remain stable for centuries. Temperatures inside many cave homes also stayed naturally cooler during hot summers and warmer during freezing winters, making life far more manageable in an otherwise difficult environment. Even now, parts of the region still feel disconnected from the modern world, especially at sunrise when hot air balloons drift silently above valleys filled with ancient stone dwellings. El Chaltén sits beneath mountain peaks so jagged and unpredictable that climbers from around the world still consider them among the most difficult on Earth. Strong winds regularly sweep across this region of Patagonia at speeds capable of knocking people off balance, while weather conditions can change dramatically within a single hour. The village itself lies near the base of Mount Fitzroy, surrounded by glaciers, forests, and massive granite spires rising above the landscape. Compared to many places in Patagonia, El Chaltén is relatively young. It was officially founded in 1985, partly to strengthen Argentina's presence near the remote southern border region. Despite its growing popularity with hikers, the area still feels isolated because of the sheer scale of the wilderness surrounding it. Roads crossing Patagonia can stretch for enormous distances, with very few settlements in between, while harsh winters and strong winds continue to shape daily life. And unlike many mountain villages, the danger here does not only come from snow or altitude. Patagonia's weather itself can become the biggest challenge. But isolation is not always connected to extreme wilderness alone. Mürren stands on a mountain terrace high above one of the deepest valleys in the Swiss Alps. There are no regular roads leading directly into the village. Instead, most visitors arrive by cable car or mountain train, a detail that immediately makes the place feel quieter and more isolated than many other alpine destinations. The village sits roughly 1,650 meters above sea level, around 5,400 feet, surrounded by towering peaks including the Eiger, Munch, and Jungfrau. During winter, heavy snow transforms the area into a landscape of frozen waterfalls, steep white cliffs, and narrow pathways cutting between wooden chalets. For generations, survival here depended on adapting to mountain conditions that could quickly become dangerous. Avalanches, rockfalls, and long winters shaped both the architecture and rhythm of daily life. Traditional wooden homes were built with steep roofs to handle snow accumulation, while farming families relied heavily on seasonal planning to prepare for colder months. And once night falls over the valley below, the surrounding mountains make the settlement feel almost suspended above the clouds themselves. Ollantaytambo was already ancient before Europeans ever arrived in South America. Built by the Inca civilization high in Peru's Sacred Valley, this settlement was designed with remarkable precision. Massive stone terraces climb the mountainsides above the village, while narrow streets and water channels built centuries ago still function today. What makes Ollantaytambo especially unusual is that people continue living inside parts of the original Inca layout. In some sections, modern homes stand directly on top of ancient stone foundations that have survived earthquakes, wars, and centuries of change. The village sits around 2,800 meters above sea level, roughly 9,200 feet, surrounded by steep Andean mountains that once helped protect the settlement from invading forces. During the Spanish conquest, Ollantaytambo even became the site of one of the Incas' most significant resistance battles. But life here was never only about defense. The Incas carefully engineered terraces to grow crops in difficult mountain conditions, while stone channels directed fresh water throughout the settlement using gravity alone. Even today, parts of that system continue working remarkably well. Rocamadour appears almost attached to the side of a cliff. Built vertically above a narrow canyon in southwestern France, the village rises in layers of stone buildings, stairways, churches, and defensive walls stacked directly into the rock itself. For centuries, Rocamadour became one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in medieval Europe. Travelers crossed huge distances to reach the village, especially after stories spread about miracles connected to a sacred Black Madonna statue kept inside the sanctuary. But reaching the settlement was never easy. Long before modern roads, visitors had to climb steep stone staircases and narrow paths built into the canyon walls. The dramatic location also offered protection during unstable periods of history, making the village both spiritually and strategically important. Today, the cliffs surrounding Rocamadour still dominate the entire landscape. Houses cling to the rock above the canyon floor, while ancient bells echo through passageways that have changed surprisingly little over time. Furong ancient town was built directly above a waterfall. Water rushes beneath sections of the settlement before continuing through a steep gorge below, creating one of the most unusual village settings anywhere in China. The town lies in the mountainous Hunan province and has a history stretching back more than 2,000 years. For long periods, the surrounding terrain helped keep the settlement relatively separated from larger urban centers, while river trade and local agriculture supported daily life. Wooden stilt houses line the cliff edges above the water, connected by narrow streets and stairways that become especially atmospheric during rain or fog. But the waterfall itself was always more than scenery. The rushing water influenced trade routes, transportation, and even the structure of the town, forcing generations of residents to adapt to the steep terrain surrounding them. And despite modern tourism reaching the area, parts of Furong still feel remarkably hidden once the sound of the waterfall begins overpowering everything else around it. For generations, fishermen in Peggy's Cove had to read the Atlantic carefully, because storms here could become deadly very quickly. The village sits along the rocky coast of Nova Scotia in Canada, where huge waves and dense fog have shaped life for centuries. Smooth granite formations surround the harbor, worn down by powerful ocean forces over thousands of years. Even today, warning signs tell visitors not to walk too close to the water when conditions become dangerous. At the center of the village stands one of the most famous lighthouses in North America. But long before tourism arrived, Peggy's Cove was a working fishing community where survival depended heavily on weather and timing. Sudden storms, freezing temperatures, and rough seas constantly threaten small boats operating along the coast. The environment still feels raw and exposed. Wind moves across the rocks almost constantly, while fog can roll in fast enough to hide much of the coastline within minutes. And despite becoming internationally recognizable, Peggy's Cove still feels surprisingly isolated during bad weather, especially when the Atlantic turns gray and violent around the harbor. But not every hidden village became isolated because of oceans or mountains. At first glance, Chefchaouen almost doesn't look real. Entire streets are covered in shades of blue, from stairways and walls to doors, alleyways and small courtyards hidden between the buildings. The color appears everywhere, creating one of the most visually unusual settlements anywhere in Morocco. The town lies within the Rif Mountains in northern Morocco, where steep terrain helped keep the area relatively isolated for long periods of history. For centuries, access into the mountains remained difficult, allowing local traditions and architecture to develop separately from larger urban centers. The reason behind the blue color is still debated. Some believe it originally symbolized spirituality and heaven, while others argue it helped keep buildings cooler during hot weather or reduced insects within the narrow streets. What makes Chefchaouen especially interesting is how quickly the atmosphere changes once you move away from the busiest tourist areas. Quiet stairways climb into older neighborhoods where daily life still revolves around local markets, mountain farming, and slow routines shaped by the surrounding landscape. Mestia sits in a valley surrounded by some of the tallest mountains in Georgia. The landscape feels enormous compared to the village itself. Snow-covered peaks rise above forests and stone towers, while narrow roads wind through terrain that can become extremely difficult during winter storms. Like Ushguli farther into the Caucasus, Mestia became known for its defensive towers built by local families centuries ago. These structures once protected residents during invasions and conflicts, while also serving as shelters during avalanches or attacks from rival groups. For long periods, isolation helped preserve the culture of the Svan people living in this region. Harsh mountain conditions and difficult travel routes kept many outside influences away, especially during winters when heavy snow could cut access to nearby valleys. But survival here demanded preparation. Wood had to be collected before winter arrived. Livestock needed protection from severe weather, and families adapted to long periods where movement through the mountains became unreliable. And although the Caucasus already feels distant from the modern world, another hidden alpine settlement ahead became isolated for a completely different reason. In Wengen, the sound that dominates the village is not traffic. It's wind moving through the valley, distant cowbells, mountain trains, and sometimes the low rumble of avalanches somewhere high above the cliffs. Unlike most alpine towns, Wengen remained largely car-free, which immediately changes the atmosphere once you arrive. The village sits around 1,275 meters above sea level, roughly 4,180 feet, on a steep mountainside in the Bernese Alps of Switzerland. For generations, isolation here was shaped less by distance and more by terrain. Before rail connections improved access, reaching the settlement required long climbs through narrow mountain paths that became dangerous during winter. Even today, heavy snow still controls much of daily life during colder months. Roofs are designed to handle huge snow loads, Trains become essential for movement, and visibility can disappear quickly when storms move through the valley. But despite the harsh environment, people continued building homes here because of farming, trade routes, and eventually tourism tied to the surrounding peaks of the Jungfrau region. Albarracín almost disappears into the landscape around it. The village is built from reddish stone and plaster that closely matches the cliffs and hills surrounding it, making the entire settlement blend into the rugged terrain of eastern Spain. From above, the walls, towers, and narrow streets appear tightly compressed between the mountains and the river below. Its isolated position helped shape its history for centuries. During the medieval period, Albarracín became heavily fortified, with defensive walls stretching across the surrounding ridges to protect the settlement from invasion. Even today, parts of those walls still climb dramatically above the village. Inside the old town, streets remain steep, narrow, and uneven, originally designed long before modern vehicles existed. And while the village attracts visitors now, isolation once made everyday survival much harder. Winters in this region can still become surprisingly cold, while the surrounding terrain historically limited movement and trade. But not every hidden place was built to defend against enemies or survive mountain winters. From the air, Huacachina looks almost impossible. An entire village surrounds a small green lagoon in the middle of enormous sand dunes, creating one of the strangest landscapes in Peru. Beyond the oasis, the desert stretches outward in nearly every direction with very little interruption. Water made settlement possible here long before tourism arrived. In a region where temperatures regularly climb above 30 degrees Celsius, around 86 degrees Fahrenheit, reliable fresh water transformed this isolated area into a rare point of survival within the desert. Today, the dunes surrounding Huacachina attract travelers from around the world, especially for sandboarding and dune buggy rides across slopes that can reach surprising heights. But once the engines disappear into the distance, the isolation of the environment becomes much more noticeable. The desert changes quickly after sunset. Temperatures drop. Strong winds reshape sections of the dunes, and the surrounding silence begins to feel almost unnatural compared to the movement of the daytime crowds. But deserts are not the only places where geography forced communities into unusual locations. Only a narrow pedestrian bridge connects Civita di Bagnoregio to the outside world. Without it, the village would stand completely isolated on top of a steep volcanic plateau in central Italy. Massive erosion has slowly worn away the surrounding cliffs for centuries, earning the settlement a dramatic nickname, often translated as the Dying City. The danger is real. Earthquakes, landslides, and collapsing rock have repeatedly threatened the plateau beneath the village. And over time, much of the original surrounding land simply disappeared into the valley below. What remains today feels almost suspended above empty space. Despite the fragile setting, people have continued living here for hundreds of years. Stone houses line narrow medieval streets, flower-covered balconies overlook the cliffs, and small passageways wind toward viewpoints where the surrounding landscape stretches for huge distances in every direction. And although Civita di Bagnoregio feels isolated today, there are villages where separation from the outside world became even more extreme during long alpine winters. Hallstatt is squeezed between a mountain and a lake so narrow that there was barely enough room to build the village at all. For centuries, people expanded upward instead of outward, constructing homes along steep slopes above the water in one of Austria's most dramatic alpine landscapes. Long before modern tourism transformed the village into an international destination, Hallstatt survived because of something hidden deep inside the mountain behind it. Salt mining here dates back more than 7,000 years, making it one of the oldest continuously active salt regions in the world. The mineral became so valuable that entire trade networks developed around this isolated settlement, even though reaching it was once extremely difficult. Until the 19th century, many visitors arrived mainly by boat because the surrounding mountains restricted road access. the environment still dominates the village visually. Snow covers the rooftops during winter, fog moves across the lake in the early mornings, and enormous cliffs rise directly behind the church tower at the center of the settlement. But despite Hallstatt becoming famous worldwide, traces of its isolated past remain surprisingly easy to notice once the crowds disappear. Brightly colored wooden buildings surround a tiny harbor on the coast of Malta, giving the entire place an almost artificial appearance. That feeling exists for a reason. Popeye Village was originally constructed in 1979 as a film set for the musical movie Popeye, starring Robin Williams. Instead of using temporary scenery, builders created an entire seaside settlement from scratch inside a sheltered bay surrounded by steep cliffs and clear Mediterranean water. More than 40 years later, the village still remains standing. What makes the location especially unusual is how isolated it feels, despite its cinematic origin. The settlement sits at the bottom of a narrow coastal inlet, where strong winds and rough sea conditions can occasionally make the area feel surprisingly cut off from the rest of the island. The colorful wooden structures were designed to resemble an old fishing community, with crooked rooftops, uneven balconies, and narrow walkways climbing above the harbor. Over time, weather and sea air gradually aged the buildings, giving the village a much more authentic appearance than most film sets ever achieve. And once evening light begins reflecting across the bay, the entire place starts feeling less like a tourist attraction and more like a strange hidden settlement left behind beside the sea. But the next village became isolated in a completely different way. In Giethoorn, many homes can only be reached by boat. There are no normal streets running through the center of the village. Instead, narrow canals connect houses, gardens, and small wooden bridges across a landscape that feels unusually quiet compared to most modern towns in the Netherlands. The village originally developed in a wet marshland area, where peat extraction shaped both the terrain and daily life. Over time, digging peat created long, narrow waterways, and residents gradually adapted by moving supplies and people across canals instead of roads. Even now, much of the village remains remarkably calm because electric boats have largely replaced noisy engines in the central area. Traditional farmhouses with thatched roofs stand beside the canals, many surrounded by flowers and small private docks. During foggy mornings, parts of Giethoorn can feel almost detached from the outside world, despite being located in one of Europe's most densely populated countries. And although the village appears peaceful today, its unusual layout developed because the surrounding wetlands once made normal transportation extremely difficult. Ise was built high above the Mediterranean for one simple reason: protection. Perched on a rocky hilltop along the French Riviera, the village originally developed as a fortified settlement where residents could spot approaching threats from far out at sea. Even today, the position feels dramatic. Narrow stone streets climb sharply upward, while steep cliffs drop toward the coastline far below. During hotter months, the thick stone walls still help keep parts of the village surprisingly cool despite the strong Mediterranean sun. What makes Easy especially unusual is the contrast between isolation and luxury. The French Riviera below became associated with wealth, tourism, and crowded beaches. Yet the village above still feels separated from much of that atmosphere once you move deeper into the old streets. And the higher you climb, the more the surroundings begin resembling a fortress rather than a typical coastal town. These villages survived because people learned how to live in places most others avoided. From Arctic Greenland to the mountains of Nepal, every community in this journey was shaped by isolation, harsh weather, and landscapes that still control daily life, even today. And despite how connected the modern world has become, places like these continue to exist far beyond the usual roads and cities.